In this video, we're going to explore educational dialogue in terms of multimodality and particularly thinking about how we can support dialogue with digital technology. The video will cover two main aspects to explore issues around educational dialogue and digital technology in terms of theory and practice, as well as research and analysis. So where does digital technology fit when exploring classroom dialogue? We can think about it when we're in a classroom and everyone is together in terms of digital technologies used by the teacher and those used by students. We can also consider use of digital technology and dialogue where everyone is accessing learning from different places. And it's also important to consider any issues of accessibility, equity, and participation in the online dialogue that may ensue. And we can also consider teachers and students as both consumers and creators of content and understanding when engaging in dialogue and around use of digital technologies. I just wanted to share a couple of quotes with you. So this one I'll read for you. The impact of information technology will be even more radical than the harnessing of steam and electricity in the 19th century. Rather, it will be more akin to the discovery of fire by early ancestors, since it will prepare the way for a revolutionary leap into a new age that will profoundly transform human culture. So some quite grand claims there, but that quote's actually from 1991, so not that far long ago. Then reframed by Diana Laurillard in 2008, education is on the brink of being transformed through learning technologies. However, it has been on that brink for some decades now, and we can reflect on where we might be in terms of that transformation, that brink right now. But it also raises, very importantly for us, the importance of pedagogy in considering how we actually use digital technologies to support and facilitate dialogue, rather than expecting the tools to transform practice and learning in and of themselves. So how can we use digital technologies with our students to support effective dialogue? There are a number of things that we can think about and ways of exploring this. Obviously, we can consider what tools are available and how we use them and why. These images show interactive whiteboards in different classroom environments used to show stimuli and images, to do physical activities around them, and to annotate those images live in classroom in the educational activity. And obviously those annotations can be made by teachers and students alike. And we can also consider, importantly, how the use of those tools affects participation in the dialogue and interaction. How are students encouraged to engage in the dialogue and the issues being covered through the use of these tools? One important element that technology mediated resources potentially bring in is the use and reuse over time to support dialogue, where for instance, this interactive whiteboard slide can be used in subsequent lessons, annotated, changes made and revised and kept, which highlights the affordances of provisionality as well as permanence of any digitally mediated objects, and how these can be used by teachers and learners to reinforce and develop understanding over time. In terms of the multimodal lens, we can also consider what different modes of communication are brought together. We can see here, for instance, video, still images, taking video as well as viewing them. We can also have talk, we can have writing. But importantly, not just that those modes exist, but how teachers and students orchestrate the dialogue and participation across these different tools, resources and modes towards the pedagogic intention that is underway in the lesson at the time. So we're seeing very changing patterns of education, particularly recently, in terms of a shift to online and distance learning. Obviously that's always been there, but it's become more prominent in recent times. So does dialogue change with online distance education? And if so, How does it do that? And how can we support effective dialogue still through these tools? What features of classroom dialogue do we want to keep in this shift to online distance learning? And how can we use digital technologies to enhance classroom dialogue? So again, focusing on the use rather than just the tools themselves. And we can think about facilitating and analysing dialogue through digital tools, as well as dialogue that takes place around digital tools. So thinking about through then, we can consider the different modes being drawn on and orchestrated in terms of spoken dialogue, written contributions, and whether people's faces are visible or invisible to other people in the conversation. We can also consider whether people are interacting and engaging in the dialogue synchronously, all at the same time, or asynchronously, and what time period this dialogue may be happening over. We can also consider there any sense of boundaries to a dialogue in terms of time as well as space. And of course, there are many tools by which we can engage in dialogue through digital tools. A number of them are listed here. So I wanted to show a few examples to you of encouraging educational dialogue through digital tools. And we've got an example here of a forum post, and we see that person A, one person offers their own thoughts on the issue at stake and brings in some evidence to back up their thoughts. Another person, person B, responds, comments on person A's contribution and raises their thoughts on that as well. And we can also see here someone else participating on the periphery, person C, by liking person B's contribution. Person B then offers their own thoughts as a follow-up to responding to person A's comments and raises their own evidence and brings in some literature to that. And person A takes their own turn in responding again. So a bit of dialogue and to and fro going on there, perhaps turn taking. And then the person who had been on the periphery, person C, now comes into the centre of dialogue, responds directly and in name to person B and offers agreement. So we can see some building on ideas in T-Setter's term, as well as offering their own contributions. And then a fourth person, person D, comes in, responds again to person B in backtracking and asks some questions back in terms of perhaps further inviting contributions to the dialogue. A more classroom-based example, we can also consider dialogue through and around technology through use of software such as Talkwall. We can see a number of instances of use here where we've got the interactive whiteboard, which hosts the central wall of all of the groups, where all can use that as a central resource. But we can also see small groups engaging with the dialogue mediated through the tool by the group version they have on a tablet in front of them. They discuss around it through speech, and they also move comments and contributions through the digital interface to form their arguments in that way. So the different modes are being orchestrated together to form contributions and arguments. So in terms of facilitating and analysing dialogue around digital tools then, we need to consider how dialogue can feed interaction with the tools and how use of the digital features can feed dialogue around it. Again, it's all around the use rather than the actual power of the tool itself. In terms of research, if we are exploring use of digital tools to support dialogue, we need to consider the analytic choices we're making and being clear and grounding this in a theoretical approach as to why we're exploring the things we are. I'm going to offer a couple of illustrations of annotated and multimodal transcription, including dialogue around use of digital technologies over the next few screens. So this example here, apologies, the pictures isn't marvellous, but it shows a teacher in front of an interactive whiteboard. There's a few prompt questions at the top and an image of a painting of the Great Fire of London. This was a Year 2 class studying the history topic of the Great Fire of London. They had a series of 8 lessons on this topic, and this was about halfway through the series of 8. So, and I've included both the spoken words, but also description of the physical movement as the speech was happening. I've not aimed to interpret those physical movements in this, but just to literally write out the gestures and the actions. So the teacher moves his hand over the picture on the whiteboard and looks at the pupils. In this picture, you're seeing he pauses, the pupils respond, fire. The teacher looks at the whiteboard. As the great fire spread, he moves his pointing finger from one side of the picture to the other, all across London, isn't it? And a pupil responds, did it actually happen? The teacher looks at the pupils. Absolutely. He holds his hands out from his elbows. This is what we've been talking about. Further beats his arms into the same position. Whole last 2 weeks. He beats his arms again. Actually, he moves towards the slide on the whiteboard, happened. He lowers his hand and moves his left hand over the picture. The great fire, I'm not making it up. He holds his arms out from his elbows again and steps to the side. It's not a story. So I've included these elements of movement in addition to the speech to highlight how this conversation unfolded in terms of the dialogue. And we can see initially perhaps a very standard IRF exchange where the teacher asks a question, the pupils all respond in chorus, and the teacher confirms the response. What happens next, however, the pupil's question, did it actually happen, is quite interesting and could certainly be considered a challenge in TSED terms. And it's quite likely in the context of a history lesson that the teacher wouldn't have anticipated a question like this. And he brings in an interesting contrast of discourse in terms of a discourse of story and the discourse of history. And we see how he uses his words and his body to emphasize the points that this is something that actually happened. They've been learning about it, and he incorporates the digital resource, the painting on the whiteboard slide, as a form of evidence, which of course is very important aligned with the history discourse. And as the researcher, I was fortunate to have been present in some of the earlier lessons, and so I was privy to some of the longer conversation of this topic, where the students had been asked to write diary entries and to make their own paintings as if they were present at the time. So we can perhaps see how these discourses of story and history became confused for the students and how this plays out through the dialogue. What is also important to emphasize, though, is that in asking this question by the pupil, it reinforces this sense of a dialogic ethos that the teacher and the pupils had created, where the pupils could ask questions, they could query understandings and help to build up this knowledge and understanding together through these activities and using the various resources to do that. In a more recent example, this is a current project in the Faculty of Education, the Virtual Internships Project. This is a research and development project working with secondary school students on challenge-based learning, which is aiming to resource meaningful links between education and enterprise by students acting and role-playing as interns in the companies BT or Huawei, who we're partnering with in this project. The students are given the task of a global challenge, such as climate change or energy efficiency, and tasked to come up with, in their groups, a local solution to this challenge. This particular group of 3 students I'm going to share with you now had identified a local challenge that some older people have difficulty in using mobile phones. So that was the challenge they decided to work on as a group. I have labelled them for ease of reference by being on the left, the middle and the right, And to humanise them a little, we'll call them Lee, Matt and Rob. So Lee, Matt and Rob were working on slightly different tasks. Lee was designing what the mobile phone would look like. Matt in the middle was conducting some research on what features should be there. And Rob was designing the interface and exploring some conversations that a user could have with through this phone in interacting with it. Now, this dialogue that takes place is solely between the students. The teacher was not involved in this element of group work at all, and they each work individually on their PCs. So Lee suggests some text for Rob to use in terms of the designing the interface. He suggests, what time is bingo tomorrow? And Rob on the right likes his suggestion, bingo. A few minutes later, Lee asks Rob, are you finished? Rob says, let me save it, I'm pretty much done. Do you want to test it? And interestingly asks, can I play? And they swap seats. And we note this request to play, and we know from research that a playful and intrinsic motivation can be far more beneficial to learning. So they're discussing around the resource, and then they swap places and continue to discuss what's happening through the digital tools. So they swap seats. And Lee now on the right reads from the interface that Rob has programmed in through Scratch. He reads, Bob has gone shopping. Jim is not available right now. And Rob realises through Lee reading this out, oh, I must not have put it in. So a form of cumulative talk going on here where they add to each other's contributions and start to realise what else needs to be done. And a moment or so later, Lee types in his response to the item he's just seen. Cheers, Jeff. And he realises, oh, you're right back. Are you free on Saturday? There's a coffee morning on. Yes. He hits enter. Hey, it works. So through this effectively cumulative talk, they're building up this resource across the different screens and around the digital tool and the interface for this mobile phone they're developing. So the teacher had tasked the students to work in groups whilst working individually on their different screens, but working together to build up the ideas around it and using dialogue to support each other's tasks. It was also important that the students see how and why the dialogue supports the tasks and the role of the digital technology as a shared resource around which to build understanding. So we've offered some examples on how this can manifest in educational dialogue and the importance on focusing on how the digital tools are used and not just on the tools themselves. So how can we use digital technologies to make our teaching practice more dialogic? We can focus on how teachers can facilitate a dialogic approach when using digital technologies, and particularly also thinking about creating that dialogic ethos where students feel able to explore ideas and explore affordances of any tools available. We also need to consider how learners can take opportunities to contribute to the dialogue through and around the use of digital technologies, and how we can analyse educational dialogue when using digital technologies. And of course, to bring the loop together, how can we feed our analytic insights back into practice to ensure that we are creating opportunities for dialogue around whatever tools are available.